Now you talked about the inflation rate and how it reduces what we actually do have to spend, even though they say they increases budget proposal from what we had in 2012. I understand that the budget of the federal government is about 45% because the states also do have their budgets and it should contribute to our growth. If that were the case, and the government comes up with this proposal and focuses on capital expenditure, because even if you have not too much money to spend, and then you spend what you do to develop infrastructure, the private sector will function properly. What about the states? Did you take a look at the role their budget plays in ensuring that even if at the top they don't have so much because of inflation, when the states do also come in, it kind of bridges the gap?
Yeah, if you could look at the state's budget as well, but rather than focus more on the state's budget, you want to look at how much the individuals in the states are spending. So each state will most likely be doing about 40–45% of their of the state's GDP from government expenditure. You have a state like Lagos, where total expenditure in Lagos in 2010 was about 2.9 trillion naira. You have a state like Kaduna, when total expenditure by people was about 1.9 trillion naira as well. So what you would expect is the private sector will drive, or the individuals, the families will drive growth at the state level rather than the state governments. And you will expect at the federal level, we'll have more investments in, for example, like I said earlier, you have more investments in agricultural processing sectors, whereby we are not just exporting raw materials, we are creating and we're adding more value to the raw materials that allows us to make more income from agricultural exports. So in reality, we'll expect more investments from the federal government's budget. We'll also expect more expenditure from the states as well. But what you will have is, it's on one side, for example, we have what I call an under budget in 2013. On the other side, on the private sector, we also have misplaced priorities from the private sector when it comes to their own budgeting.
How?
For example, you look at, you take the numbers from the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics, which is publicly available, and you look at what the private sector spends on education vis-a-vis what the private sector spends on household goods like chocolates, jams, ice cream. In 2010, for example, total expenditure on education in Nigeria by the private sector was 140 billion naira.
When you say private sector, you're talking the individuals.
Individuals.
Families.
Families, exactly. So we're looking at an economy where, as individuals, you're spending 140 billion naira on education. However, when we look at the numbers that we are spending on ice creams, on sugar, on jam, on cakes, 174 billion naira. So you have a double tragedy whereby the private sector seems to have misplaced its priorities when it comes to their own private sector budgets. And you have on the government side, you have another budget. So on one side, we shouldn't just look at finding ways of how the government can increase revenue so that we are more competitive when we look at the other countries that we want to compare ourselves with. On the private sector, we also have to ask ourselves, why are we placing our priorities on things that don't really give us value?
Yeah, but should we, while looking at that, should we also look at the fact that, yes, they spend that money on that. How did those goods even come about? Isn't that also boosting that sector? Because when you spend that money, production, growing that sector also. Should we gloss over that?
Not necessarily. We will probably have been happier with if all the sugars and ice creams and jams and cakes that we are consuming were produced locally. However, you have a country where we're spending more on cakes, on ice creams, and those cakes and ice creams are being imported. So it's not a very, very favorable position that we
I
find
think
ourselves in.
one of the questions will also be, how did they come about that figure? Does it also take into cognizance, say, capital flight to education? Because, I mean, lots of Nigerians, have their children abroad, and 140 billion might not be able to cover or capture effectively that amount that is spent on education abroad.
Again, the amount spent on education abroad will be hard to accurately measure. What we know regarding the educational sector is what, for example, going back to the budget, what the government has proposed to spend on the educational sector in Nigeria, which is about 457 billion naira. What we also know on the educational sector is for every 100 students that go through the primary school, only 3 really get admitted into the university. What we know about the educational sector is for every 100 Nigerians, only 1 owns a computer. What we know about the educational sector, when we look at the budget, for example, is you pick up the budget of the Federal Ministry of Educational, the headquarters, and you discover that there's a budget of less than 90 million that goes into buying new library books, a budget of less than 90 million that goes into buying new computers and new softwares. On the flip side, there's a budget of 130 million naira that goes into buying new vehicles. Probably, yes, they need the vehicles. But we also have to ask ourselves that, looking at the numbers of the number of people that actually make it into the universities from our primary schools, shouldn't we sacrifice some part of this budget, which is the vehicle budget, into trying to promote more educational investments? Should we have a position whereby 130 million naira is spent on vehicles and have less than 90 million naira spent on buying books, spent on buying computers, spent on buying computer softwares? It also lets us know where most likely our priorities are.
Okay.
But it doesn't also take cognizance, sorry, Nyota, of the distribution. So that when you're saying that, out of every 100 Nigerians who enter primary school, only 3 are in university, that figure doesn't take cognizance of the distribution of, how these Nigerians are spread, does it?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. But I'm really not too bothered
Wouldn't
about...
that be important in terms of how you budget and how you plan?
It will be. It should be. But you will find a position where we're still on the budgeting when it comes to education. You have a position where, like I said earlier, we talk about the Chinese economy. What have they done right that we haven't done right? In China, for example, like I said, the government spends 5 times, despite their 1.3 billion population, the government spends 5 times what the Nigerian government spends per citizen in China. The Nigerian government has an average budget, like I keep saying, of about $200 per citizen. In China, the government spends about $1,100 per citizen. As long as we keep looking at our budget from a perspective of where are we coming from, what was our budget last year, what was our budget 2 years ago, what was our budget 3 years ago, and we use that as a benchmark to say we budgeted 4.7 trillion last year.
Okay.
Let's take it by an extra 5% this year. Let's take it by an extra 8% next year. We lose the points.
Okay, the last, as we round up, the last guest we had was talking about the medium-term expenditure framework. Now, the picture he painted is that the executive is sort of like divided. They are now agreeing on that, on the MTEF. And that, for them, which they have passed in the House, they have passed it, and that's why they came up with the $80 benchmark. Now, if you had the opportunity to advise the executive and the National Assembly, what would you say to them?
Briefly, too, because of other time.
3 things. Invest more in the agricultural processing sector, invest more in the security sector, especially when it comes to the mobile security sector, when it comes to enough fueling for the vehicles. And the $75 or $80 benchmark really doesn't change anything much.